And now I have the honor to introduce to you the keynote speaker for INREM 2021. Dr. Dennis Garrity is a systems agronomist and research leader whose career has focused on improving small-scale farming systems in the tropics. He has been serving as Drylands Ambassador for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, emphasizing the role of agroforestry, evergreen agriculture, and land care for sustainable land management. From 2001 to 2011, he was Director General of the World Agroforestry Center. He is currently chair of the board of the Global EverGreening Alliance, a partnership of nearly all of the major development and conservation organizations around the world, working together to restore hundreds of millions of hectares of degraded land and enhance the livelihoods of millions of smallholder farm families in the tropics. He leads the development of the EverGreening the Earth campaign to be drawing down 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually from the atmosphere by 2050. As head of the Farming Systems Program at the International Rice Research Institute and as a professor at the University of the Philippines during the 1980s, so he's part of the UP community. He advised 47 PhD and MSc students and postdoctoral fellows from Africa, Asia, Europe, and the US. During the 1990s, he was based in Indonesia, where he launched and developed the Southeast Asia Regional Program of ECRAF. To give the keynote address titled Code Red and Code Green, Reflections on the Future of Landscape Restoration, it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Dennis P. Garrity. A big round of virtual applause to Dr. Garrity as he delivers INREM 2021's keynote address.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Juan Pulin for the warm invitation that he extended to join you and speak from the campus of the University of the Philippines here in Los Baños. I want to share with you some remarks on the topic Code Red and Code Green, Reflections on the Future of Landscape Restoration. Code Red refers, of course, to the recent remarks of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in reference to the recent IPCC report, in which he stated that the climate emergency is a code red and the battle for our lives. Then there's Code Green. And now what's all that about? Well, you've probably already aware that the tectonic plate of global interest in landscape restoration is shifting dramatically. And this shift has created a tidal wave of new interest in forestry and agroforestry around the world because of their essential contributions to massive restoration for carbon storage in terrestrial ecosystems. The great wave of interest in restoration is quite recent, largely because the private sector is now moving forcefully to invest billions of dollars in restoration carbon credits. This is in addition to the renewed interest of the public sector donors and the accelerating interest of the general public around the world in supporting and getting engaged in restoration. The new interest by the private sector is due largely to the Race to Zero, an initiative launched a couple of years ago to provide a more concrete foundation to the Paris Agreement. More than 120 countries and over 5,000 of the world's largest corporations have now made formal pledges to zero out their net emissions by 2050, and many of them are now setting targets to reduce their emissions by 50% by the year 2030, just 9 years away. So indeed, As we stand here at the beginning of the UN Decade for Ecosystems Restoration, we're seeing a vast acceleration of the whole process of restoration in the world situation. And I think that one huge challenge for restoration professionals is that the demand for trained and experienced talent to be able to implement effective restoration programs and to monitor the outcomes will soon exceed the availability of pertinent talent in landscape restoration everywhere. Later, I'm going to dwell on some of the more significant areas where I see a big talent gap developing, a topic that I suppose would be of interest to many of the younger members of our audience today. But let me begin by briefly reminding us how serious the climate emergency actually is. And then I'll rapidly move on to the restoration goals and targets that we believe must be achieved to address the environmental crises that we face. The most recent science is telling us some things that may actually be worse than you had thought. Global heating is actually accelerating year by year and accelerating well beyond the previous model projections. Therefore, the planet may very likely breach the 1.5 degree C Paris target within the next decade. Indeed, we may already be above 1.5 by 2030, a full decade ahead of the IPCC projections. The World Meteorological Organization corroborated this in a report just released a few months ago, as well as the IPCC itself. So much for the battle cry of keeping 1.5 alive. I'm afraid it's actually very much on life support in the intensive care unit right now, as the Secretary General of the UN said in his closing remarks at COP26 in Glasgow. So apparently, for all practical purposes, we may be losing the battle to even stay within 1.5 degrees. But how about the 2-degree Paris target? 2 degrees is now likely to occur before 2050, and this is very dangerous. The scientific evidence is mounting that by the time we reach 2 degrees C, humanity may be already have triggered a cascade of virtually irreversible tipping points that will lead to a hothouse Earth scenario of rising temperatures that are out of humanity's control. There are many such tipping points that can contribute to this out of control situation, unfortunately. 9 of them are highlighted on this map, published in 2018 by a large group of global change scientists in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. Up at the top, Arctic sea ice is already well past its tipping point, and this warming up is causing the Greenland ice sheet now to pour enormous quantities of cold, fresh water into the North Atlantic. The Arctic sea ice is tipping the Greenland ice sheet. This process is slowing down the Gulf Stream that carries warm ocean water from the southern hemisphere to the north and is what keeps Europe from turning into Siberia-like frigidity. Now, as the Gulf Stream slows down in its path from south to north, the southern Atlantic Ocean is now warming up alarmingly, the backup of this ocean current. And this is, of course, the more frequent and prolonged droughts in the Amazon, the cause of these frequent and prolonged droughts. This means that there is now a very real possibility that the Amazon rainforest will tip into becoming a much drier, savanna-like ecosystem that releases enormous quantities of biomass carbon into the atmosphere. This is what is seen as a cascade of negative tipping points, like a set of dominoes that fall down one after the other. And then there is the tipping point that scares me the most, the permafrost melting in the polar region, which would unleash an accelerating torrent of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. And we do know now that the global methane emissions are currently accelerating quite rapidly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is bad news for humankind. So what are the critical actions needed to head off these tipping points? Well, first of all, zero emissions at emergency speed. We're talking 2030, not 2050, as the crucial time frame. And the Earth is already too hot. It requires a large-scale carbon drawdown, absolutely vital to reversing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And finally, adaptation actions must kick in to protect the vulnerable, a major debate during the recent COP meetings. Now, this IPCC graph shows the general pathway to emissions reduction that is essential to achieve net emissions by mid-century. You'll note the expectation that emissions will continue to increase until 2030, unfortunately, and then must turn drastically downwards thereafter. The critical questions are, can humanity rise to the task? Can this possibly be done? Now I've added into the graph the annual absorption of CO2 by the oceans and the land base, which you see below the baseline. Together, the land and the oceans are already drawing down over 20 billion tons of CO2 every year, which is reducing the actual amount of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere by about half. The rate at which the concentration of CO2 increases every year is now 50% less than it would have been had not the oceans and the land come to the rescue, which could make it possible for the world to achieve net emissions by about 2040 or 2050 if we can augment the terrestrial ecosystem's drawdown. It could be done by ramping up the drawdown potential by vastly scaling up nature-based solutions that will evergreen the Earth. Such a process could enable us to be in negative emissions territory by mid-century, as shown by the blue zone drawn at the bottom of this graph. The IPCC recognizes that negative emissions will now be absolutely vital to any attempt to stabilize the global temperature, and nature-based solutions are clearly the most cost-effective, the most scalable way of achieving that goal. I chair the board of the Global EverGreening Alliance, and I've been deeply engaged in developing it over the last decade. The Alliance's mission is to achieve massive impact in land restoration globally. We have now over 60 member organizations, including virtually all of the biggest conservation NGOs and development NGOs around the world. Organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, WWF, etc., working in countries everywhere. We also have many regional, national, and local partners as organizational members, and a number of research organizations that provide technical support to our work, such as the World Agroforestry Center and the World Resources Institute. The Alliance has mobilized its members around a mission of restoration in both the public and private sectors. And we partner with the United Nations agencies such as UNEP, FAO, UNDP, and with governments throughout the world to implement massive regional and national restoration programs. We analyzed the recent literature on the potential for nature-based solutions to achieve a massive drawdown of CO2. Some of the recent key publications that have dwelt on this topic are listed here, most notably the book on drawdown by Paul Hawken and the analyses of Griscom and Bastin, published in respected journals. We knew that to do more than simply engage in restoration, we needed to spearhead a big, audacious drawdown goal that could draw the world together to inspire and drive restoration action at all levels, from the global to the national and right down to the individual community. The published evidence clearly shows the enormous potential for nature-based solutions to be a cornerstone of the CO2 drawdown effort and to provide many co-benefits to livelihoods, poverty reduction, biodiversity protection, etc. So we've added up the streams of realistic possibilities, and we established the goal of capturing an additional 20 billion tons of CO2 every year by mid-century, while improving livelihoods and land care, particularly of the poorest and most vulnerable rural populations, and caring much better for the land than we have done in the past. The 20 billion goal is the basis for EverGreening the Earth, Green Up to Cool Down campaign, which was launched at the United Nations 2 years ago. It is truly an ambitious goal, but for the sake of humanity, we must be determined to achieve it. The Global EverGreening campaign is focused like a laser on all the ways that forest and landscape restoration can contribute to this process. And indeed, we work with the Trillion Trees program of the World Economic Forum and the UN Decade on Ecosystems Restoration in this ambitious effort, and with many other efforts as well. And as I said earlier, the interest and commitments to restoration have been growing exponentially during the last couple of years. Now, the encouraging news is that over the past couple of decades, an area of forest the size of France has been regenerated throughout the world. This is nearly 60 million hectares of restored forests during the past 20 years, and this data shows that the regeneration process is already significant, but it must be vastly increased and accelerated. Here is a map of where some of the greatest concentrations of forest restoration have already occurred in Asia and in Europe. You'll note the many zones of dark purple and bright green, which are the zones of the greatest area where forests have been restored. We aim to ramp up and accelerate the restoration process across these and many, many other zones across the globe. In fact, there are so many vast areas of the world where this kind of commitment can make a difference. Here is a map of the extent of the world's degraded lands where evergreening can be greatly increased. There are billions of hectares out there where there is the potential for reversing this degradation to restoration, if we act now and as if our lives and livelihoods depended on it. Reversing the degradation processes on only a fraction of these lands can create the 20 billion tons of drawdown per year that we have targeted by mid-century. Indeed, after recent analyses have shown that the world has room to comfortably accommodate at least 1 trillion more trees without sacrificing agricultural or rangeland production, we are on our way. But the 22 billion trees that have been restored so far during the past 2 decades is only 2% of this potential. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot of room for restoration to grow and spread to every community in every part of the globe. The campaign's global goal is made up of a number of target areas for capturing and storing more carbon in the world's landscapes. We've laid out unique strategies for the ecosystems of degraded farmlands, degraded forest lands, and degraded rangelands. For example, the EverGreening the Earth campaign has pledged to restore tree cover on 575 million hectares of degraded forest lands in the next 30 years. and thereby create and capture an additional 8.5 billion tons of CO2 per year from the atmosphere. And this is only about 1/3 of the treeless degraded forest land of the world, which is over 1.7 billion hectares. Now, much of this land can be restored by natural regeneration or by deploying assisted natural regeneration, low-cost alternatives to planting trees. Indeed, natural regeneration is much cheaper than tree planting, and it brings with it major advantages in biodiversity conservation, and it enhances many other environmental and productive services for people and the planet. Ethiopia is an example of this. This country has committed itself to restoring over 15 million hectares of degraded watershed areas by 2030, and it is already well along the way to achieving this national goal by deploying what is known as watershed closures. Highly degraded watersheds are allowed to rest from intensive human and livestock pressure, rapidly regenerated a forest cover that provides much greater benefits to local populations. Similarly, assisted natural regeneration has enabled communities in many other countries to have restoration success, as in this formerly degraded watershed on the island of Bohol in the Philippines. One trend that may have huge implications for land restoration and the rewilding of the planet in the coming decades is a great disruption in the global food system, which is starting to roll out. Indeed, this great disruption is happening because the cost of plant-based meat and cell-cultured meat have been declining exponentially during the past decade, as you see in these graphs. As they reach prices that are substantially lower than animal meat, and as the demand for these products increases rapidly because they cost less, these animal meat substitutes may capture the majority of the global market for meat, perhaps as much as 80% of the market by 2035 or soon thereafter. The entire animal meat industry may by then be on the road to collapse. This would release vast areas of land that is currently devoted to the production of cattle and other meat and dairy species. The disruption of 80% of the animal meat market is projected to reduce the amount of cropland that is producing livestock feed grains and the amount of grazing land that is needed for ruminant livestock production by a whopping 2.7 billion hectares. This is land that would therefore become marginal to agriculture and thus revert passively to restore natural ecosystems. The process of marginal farmland reverting back to forest is a process that we're very familiar with in some countries, like the United States, where over the past century, hundreds of millions of hectares of former cropland have reverted back to naturally regenerated forests. Indeed, Robin Chasden and her colleagues published a study last year that documented this reversion of marginal farmland to naturally regenerated forest over hundreds of millions of hectares in Europe and Asia, as well as the Americas, during the past several decades. If such a process were to accelerate by means of the great disruption of the animal agriculture industry, this would be a huge boost to the notion that half of planet Earth could be rewilded that Professor E.O. Wilson has proposed. 50% of the planet could be rewilded. It would be a huge boost to achieving the goal of annually drawing down additional 20 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere as well. And the interesting thing is that the disruption could be driven simply by lower prices for plant-based or cultured meat compared to animal-derived meat, reinforced by a desire of more and more consumers to shift their dietary habits away from animal meat. Price and dietary motivation. These are strongly reinforcing trends. Indeed, this disruption for us in restoration is one to keep an eye on, as we also follow the parallel market disruption in the energy sector due to rapidly falling prices for solar and wind energy and battery storage systems, and the massive disruption in the transport sector that is now solidly underway due to the emerging price parity or price advantage of electric vehicles with gasoline-powered vehicles. All three of these disruptions are happening because it is becoming cheaper to switch to the new and more environmentally suitable alternatives. The prices of new technology are simply becoming more attractive than sticking with the old. Such is the basis for reaching and exceeding positive tipping points, and doing so quite rapidly. To succeed in attaining our EverGreening goal, we believe that we must also focus a great deal of our attention on restoration efforts on the degraded farmlands and rangelands of the world. And this we can do by dramatically increasing productive tree cover on agricultural lands, particularly smallholder agriculture, through agroforestry. This is a process now known as evergreen agriculture. Fortunately, this trend is already happening as well. We now know that the farmlands of the world already have more than 10% tree cover, and that the percentage is increasing almost everywhere, particularly in the tropics. We can accelerate this process. Take the case of Southeast Asia. Indeed, in the extensive purple areas, which occur in the Philippines and Indonesia here on this map, tree cover on agricultural land has now exceeded 30%. Tree cover on farmlands throughout the region is increasing particularly fast. In the mainland Southeast Asian countries as well, as shown by the green areas in this map. There is enormous innovation underway to combine trees and crops for higher annual income and resilience to production shocks, particularly on the 500 million smallholder farms of the world. India is a leader in this agroforestry effort, as it is a vast nation of very small farms. This slide is an example of wheat production combined with fruit production and an upper story of prune, fast-growing timber trees. A truly dramatic example of successful farmland restoration has taken place in Africa. This occurred initially in Niger, the poorest country in the world. There, the process of desertification on smallholder farmlands had been devastating because of 2 decades of drought during the 1970s and 1980s. But today, over 7 million hectares of this formerly denuded farmland in Niger has been restored through the practice of farmer-managed natural regeneration of trees. Farmers selected and nurtured useful tree species that had emerged naturally on their semi-arid farmlands. This process, engaged in by about 2 million farm families, has restored a moderate tree cover on farmlands in the dry zones. This process of tree restoration has now spread to more than 21 million hectares in the semi-arid Sahelian countries, and the process is still expanding rapidly. This photo, by the way, is not a dryland forest. This is all cropland, where farmers grow these naturally regenerated trees in their sorghum and millet fields, and the trees dramatically increase their crop yields and provide nutritious livestock fodder and fuel wood to the farm family. Farmer-managed natural regeneration is now seen by the World Bank and many other organizations as a fundamental practice, a foundational practice for a resilient dryland agriculture. The Alliance Restore Africa program is giving particular emphasis to ramping up this inexpensive and highly scalable practice to more than 100 million hectares in Africa, with and through the African Restoration 100 program. We are well on the way to accomplishing this target, as many countries in West Africa and also in East Africa and Southern Africa are now supporting the scaling up of farmer-managed natural regeneration. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we are focusing on the pasture lands of the world. We aim to regenerate 650 million hectares of degraded pasture lands and rangelands globally by assisting graziers to establish more holistic grazing systems and create a healthy grass-tree balance. Holistic grazing practices emphasize the frequent rotation of bunched herds of livestock, a system that has now been proven to restore degraded pasture land much more effectively than the conventional grazing practices that had been the accepted model for the past century. Restoring a healthy grass-tree balance through silvopastoral systems with a moderate population of trees has also now been recognized as a crucial pasture renovation solution as well. And this is the fastest growing spreading type of agroforestry practice in the United States, for example. Thus, croplands and pasturelands are now recognized as important systems that can be restored through agroforestry. Indeed, the race to restore is now revving up as a global aspiration. Already, the race to zero has gained enormous momentum, whereby 120 countries and over 5,000 corporations have committed to zero emissions by mid-century. These entities are now, or soon will be, purchasing carbon credits en masse to meet their emissions gaps on the road to zero emissions. And one thing that the recent Glasgow Climate Pact did achieve from COP26 was an agreement on how to streamline and support the fast developing national and voluntary carbon markets. The market for restoration carbon credits is now reaching billions of dollars per year. This brings me back to the huge restoration talent gaps that we are seeing develop because of this enormous shift towards restoration. Number one, in my view, there's an obvious gap in talent that is needed to effectively restore degraded forest lands, as well as degraded farmlands and rangelands. So here we're not talking only about more limited areas of ecological restoration, but restoring natural ecosystems, but also the grand challenges in restoring managed degraded ecosystems. Second, there's the talent gap in managing and implementing projects that engage local communities in establishing and achieving their restoration goals. Here, social mobilization skills are preeminently important in facilitating such processes, as, for example, restoring a community forest from overuse to more vibrant health and productivity. Such skills and mindsets have been gravely lacking in the past in forestry departments all around the world, which is a major reason that so many reforestation efforts have failed in the past and continue to do so. We need a great new generation of foresters and restoration professionals that have such social skills and the motivation to use them. And third, there is the awakening giant of restoration, carbon credits projects. Carbon offsets projects have been around for a couple of decades, but when the market collapsed to $1 to $2 per ton of CO2 during the previous 10 years, this growing effort was drastically cut back. Now, as the market is surging with race to zero corporate commitments, there are exceedingly few professionals with the training and the experience to design, develop, and implement this particular type of restoration project, and to handle the complex and technical aspects of calculating baselines, assessing the amount of carbon in a landscape, and monitoring the changes effectively with field measurements and satellite imagery. I see these talent gaps widening rapidly in the coming years, and we need to figure out how to ramp up our efforts to rapidly provide the needed training and expertise for thousands upon thousands of new restoration professionals. Well, my friends, in conclusion, let's remember, as Greta says, our house is indeed very much on fire. Alok Sharma, the president of the COP, said in his closing remarks last Saturday, "This is the moment of truth for our planet, our children, and our grandchildren." And indeed, we must and can actually lead in creating a more verdant, evergreen Earth that will soak up massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere to help put out the fire and to produce so many other co-benefits that make investment in this work so satisfying. The entire world has got to mobilize on nothing less than a war footing if we are to avoid the cascade of tipping points and reverse emissions to the atmosphere. And of course, in addition, to evergreen the Earth, to draw down carbon and reverse the momentum of global heating and climate change. Yesterday, George Monbiot of the Guardian newspaper lamented the very modest progress that was achieved in the Glasgow Climate Pact produced by COP26 last weekend. He said that to him, the document reads less like a climate pact and more like a suicide pact in its willingness to continue to mortgage the future of the planet to minimize short-term inconvenience. And that is the issue. We, the professionals in natural resources, forestry, agroforestry, and restoration, have a crucial role to play in saving humanity from climate and ecological suicide. So, my friends, let's get to work. And finally, you may consult the links here to find out more about the Evergreening the Earth campaign. And I would be happy to have you contact me at the address below to discuss your interests in getting involved in the Evergreening the Earth movement and campaign. So onwards, my friends, with utmost urgency. Thank you for listening.